Okay, so we're going to proceed now on this question of justifying the line between full and partial moral standing. If we're going to treat certain beings different from a moral perspective, we need to have a reason for doing it. We can't just simply do it because we want to or because we've been told to do that. So we've looked at what moral standing is. We looked at who has it. We've looked at the idea that not everything has it in the same way, that there's full moral standing and partial moral standing. And we are, as we just said, moving towards, okay, how do we justify this line that we put in this diagram? Okay, so you should keep in mind here that what's going to happen now in the chapter, to keep the logic of the whole thing, is we're going to look at three different ways to answer this question. We're going to look at being a person, we're going to look at being a human being, and then we're going to look at a very different way of looking at it based on the definition of death. And the reason for that is we're going to actually give reasons to reject the first two, that they aren't going to help. Okay? The problem here is it's confusing because both these terms have different meanings. We may not be aware that they have different meanings. That might be confusing us, and hopefully once we sort out the different meanings, some of that confusion will go away. But there are also some logical mistakes here that people make that generate some of the controversy we have over abortion. At least that's the way an ethicist looks at it. Okay? So let's start with the first one, and I want to make some claims here to try to help make this point clearer to you. Hopefully not making it less clear by making it more confusing. So why the fact that a fetus isn't a person doesn't prove that a fetus doesn't have full moral standing. Okay? And the reason for that is that there are, figure 6, two meanings of person. Okay, so just there are the meanings there. So meaning is a being who possesses certain physical or mental capacities. They might be self-awareness, they might be rationality. Part of the point here is we don't need to argue about which of those that they are. We can just sort of let that sit. It's the idea here that there are certain things that these beings would have. But we also use the word person in a moral sense when we just mean it as a synonym for possessing full moral standing. So what does all that mean? Well, that means that we're actually two different ways of deciding whether a being is a person. One way is we will look at whether that being possesses some characteristic. Is it self-aware? Is it rational? Well, then it's a person. Put it in that category. Another way is, does it possess full moral standing? If it does, put it in that category. So that's the idea of justifying that line. How do you justify that line? Well, you justify it in two different ways. Now, people sometimes get a little confused. Is he making up meanings? No, he as he says, this is the author thinks this is just the way the English language works. Okay, so persons is like words like bank. Bank has two different meanings. Sometimes a bank is a financial institution, and sometimes we're talking about the side of a river. Okay, so if we're not aware of that, then we're going to be confused. Okay, and becoming more aware of that is supposed to take away confusion. Okay, so the confusing mistake here is identifying the group of beings possessing some certain characteristics as the same group that possesses full moral standing. That's like thinking that financial institutions are also sides of rivers. We want to say, well, that's just the way the English language works. It's just a mistake, okay? And we need to be clear about that, otherwise we will end up being confused. Okay, so fetuses, it's a mistake to think that fetuses lack full moral status simply because they do not possess certain capacities. Okay, that's the application of the two meanings. Okay, that it's really two different ways of looking at fetuses. Fetuses are not persons in the sense that they don't possess self-awareness or they don't possess rational capacities. Again, whichever one you want to pick. Okay, um, or but that doesn't mean that fetuses lack full moral status. That's still an open question. Okay, if we were trying to figure out which things in the world possess full moral status and which don't, we don't really have any reason to put fetuses in one or the other. We still have to figure that out. Okay, so the two meanings of person are what we might call logically independent. They don't imply each other at all. That means that you can have some beings that have full moral standing and have rational capacities, like adult human beings. You can have some beings that lack both. Maybe an example of this would be a rock or a bank. Okay, or it's possible to have full moral standing and lack rational capacities, and to lack full moral standing and to have rational capacity. We simply don't know because the two definitions of persons are independent. Okay, so the mistake here, the confusion, is to confuse one use for the other use. Okay, so the text says the bottom line is that some people use the term person to identify those with certain physical or mental characteristics, such as self-awareness, while other people, use the term to identify those who by definition have moral standing, regardless of whether they possess any particular mental or physical characteristics. Okay, so we are being told, keep those two things in mind when we go about using the word person, but also realize don't argue from one to the other. So there's an example, and I guess I took it out here. Okay, but it's important here to keep in mind, could rational capacities be a basis for full moral standing? Well, the point here is it could. We're not ruling that out. This is the whole one of the confusing things is we're making negative claims here and not positive claims. You know, if you're trying to look, please tell me what are the full things with full moral status. Well, I'm not doing that. I am telling you, though, don't automatically think it's persons because they have certain physical capacities. Okay, so we're not saying that you couldn't argue for the moral value of persons based on the fact that they possess rational capacities. What we are saying is that having rational capacities does not always mean a being has full moral standing. So there's an interesting or relevant point here. Where is it? It's on page 41, where it's talking about, where the text is talking about persons in the non-moral sense, and it says, it should be clear that if person is described descriptively, that is by citing one or more crucial properties such as self-awareness, nothing follows about whether such persons have moral status. One always needs some moral assumption to justify a conclusion about moral status. Okay, so it's the point being made is it's not simply solved by definition. But there's another quote, proving that some non-moral characteristics such as self-awareness or a unique genetic code is what it takes to establish full moral standing is extremely difficult to do. If such a link could be proved, someone would have to have done so by now, and the abortion definition of death and animal rights debates would be over. At least that's what our author thinks. And here he's relying on his own experience in this. We probably would have to take his word for it. Okay, so as a summary here, let's keep in mind a couple things. Only the descriptive meaning of person is going to be useful. If we can't make some claim about persons, we're not, the other one just sort of says just means full moral status. But it doesn't mean anything moral by itself, and it would be bad reasoning to argue otherwise. So we should reject the concept of person as providing us with enough to figure out whether something, in our case, a fetus, has full moral status.